joining us today at Bruegel for what promises to be a very exciting event on energy assets in Sub-Saharan Africa. My name is Simone Tagliapietra. I'm an energy and climate fellow here at Bruegel, and I am particularly pleased to have you here and have this debate today in Brussels, because the issue of energy assets in Sub-Saharan Africa is, in my view, something that is really strategic for the long-term development of Africa itself, but it also has a very strong impact on the outlook for Europe. As a matter of fact, energy access is, as we all know, a key prerequisite for socio-economic development. That cannot be solid and structural development without strong and solid access to energy. And energy access continue to represent a key challenge in Sub-Saharan Africa, where 2 out of 3 of the people living there do not have access to energy, and where every year 600,000 people die due to the consequences of indoor air pollution due to notably the use of biomass for cooking, but also for lighting. Overcoming the energy access barrier in Sub-Saharan Africa therefore represents probably the crucial step to allow the unleash of the socio-economic development of the subcontinent. Over the last 2 years, in Europe, there was a growing attention to the Africa development overall as a consequence of the migration crisis, and several initiatives have been launched, such as the EU External Investment Plan by the European Commission, the Marshall Plan with Africa initiative of the German presidency of the G20, all these initiatives with a strong emphasis on energy and energy access. With this event, we would like to discuss not only the outlook for energy access in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also the potential role that Europe might eventually play in fostering energy access and energy development in Africa. To do so, we will be guided by our distinguished panelists. The first panelist, the first speaker of the day, will be Laura Cozzi, the head of the World Energy Outlook Demand Division at the International Energy Agency in Paris. Back in 2040, the Energy Agency published a major report on African energy, which really sparked a debate about this issue for the first time, probably. And in 2 weeks' time, the International Energy Agency will publish a new special report of the World Energy Outlook devoted to energy and development. So we are really grateful to Laura to be here today with us in order to share some of the insights of this very important exercise. The panel discussion will then see the interventions of Lapo Pistelli, the Executive Vice President of Eni, the Italian international energy company that probably has engaged the most over the last decades on Africa. We will then have the intervention of Lex Urderman from the World Bank, and finally from San Bilal, the head of trade and investment and finance program at the European Center for Development Policy Management. Without much further ado, I would then immediately give the floor to Laura for her kickoff presentation. Laura, the floor is yours.
First of all, good morning, everyone. We are under the rain of Brussels today, but it shouldn't still hamper us from having a very, very lively and good discussion on the continent that is certainly the most lively in terms of what's happening on energy nowadays. First of all, big thanks to Bruegel for having initiated this conference. As Simone mentioned, the timing is maybe a bit difficult for me, because we are actually launching our report in 2 weeks of time in Rome. The choice of Rome is not a coincidence. It's really, I think, a testimony of what Italy at the highest level is trying to do to put Africa at the center of the attention at every political debate. And we have decided to have, in fact, it's the first time that the IEA launches a publication, that's the global launch in Italy. So it's really a double testimony of the importance that this G7 presidency has put on Africa, and equally what Italian industries on energy have been doing in Africa for a very long time. Certainly, Eni with a very long-standing tradition, as well as Enel. So, without any further what I will do now, I will show you a number of slides that are mostly publicly available, but what I will try to do is to give you the glimpse of all the new things that we will be saying in a couple of weeks of time, without trying to break in the embargo that I have still to respect. So it's going to be a bit of a fine exercise.
But you are Italian, flexible. So
I will try to be as flexible as possible. A few things to put the situation in a context. We're talking about a continent that has seen one of the highest growth rates globally since 2000, so an average of around 5% GDP growth since 2000. The economy has doubled in Africa. Still, the flip side of this story is that you still have half of the population that is living in extreme poverty. Over the past 2 years, as many of the countries are still very reliant on commodity to have GDP growth, you have seen a very sluggish GDP growth in most of the continent, with a few exceptions. So that the IMF is in fact starting to talk about a two-tier Africa, two different speeds. Now, the most resilient country to growth were the ones that did not have too much reliant commodity economies. It's a region that is very unbalanced for a number of reasons. It has 30% of the global population, and it uses only 4% of global energy demand. And of this global energy demand, most of it is traditional biomass. I will come back to this. This is very, very unusual. It's the only continent in the world that has this type of peculiarity in energy use. Infrastructure and electricity infrastructure, I'm pleased that there is a World Bank fellow speaker here today, has been considered by enterprises in Africa as the single most important reason for not cause of fastest growth. It comes before red tape. It comes before bad governance. So electricity access and electricity reliability is considered one of the key break to industrial growth in Africa. Why is that? Let's put it in a very simple way. On average, in each African countries, you have 2 hours a day in which the electricity goes off. Of course, you don't know at what time it goes off. You just know it will go off at some point. So if you're planning for industrial production, if you're planning for any activity, you actually need to do, first, one very important thing, you need to have a digital generator for backup. So 50% of industry in Africa, small cottage industries up to the large ones, they do have on-site diesel generators. Now, diesel generators are excellent because they actually manage for you to keep on producing, but they do something else. Now we are lucky we are in a very low oil price situation, and still with this very low oil price situation, you would be producing electricity at 3, 4, 5 times the cost of the cheapest option. So you're actually in a continent that is the poorest, producing the most expensive electricity you can. So you're using, as my executive director says, you're using channel number 5 to actually fuel your economy. It doesn't make much sense. Another huge part of the story is the following. Africa is the continent with the largest energy resources. So it's a big contradiction that the continent with the larger resources, and when I talk about energy resources, it's everything. There is a lot of oil, there is a lot of gas, there is plenty of renewables. It's the continent with the least energy use. Absurd. Finally, one very key point, because to change the situation, you need investment. So how much money is Africa attracting in terms of investment in energy today? Globally, we're spending around 1.6 trillion every year on energy, and Africa attracts around 1% of it. In fact, if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa alone, it's much less than that. On one hand, it's a bad news. On the other hand, it's very easy to scale up. So you start from a very low base. We can do things pretty quickly. Now, here starts the fine exercise. Those are all data. They show you access by access electricity rate and the tremendous population growth that has happened since 2000. Until 2013, we basically were seeing that despite efforts in many countries, electrification rate did not keep up with population growth. So the number of people without access to electricity, actually they were increasing. Despite efforts, the number of people without access to electricity have been increasing constantly since 2000 every year until 2013. Now, in the new report that we'll be launching on the 19th, we're going to give rather good news. Since 2013, 2014, 15, and 16, for the first time, we are seeing within the continent to see every year electrification efforts have been more than compensating for population growth. Is it happening everywhere? No. We see countries that are moving fast. It's Gambia, it's Ethiopia, it's Kenya. There are pockets where things are moving. And they're moving through a combination of things. It's not one unique way forward. In some cases, it's grid expansion that is providing electricity access. In some other cases, we are seeing technological cost reduction, especially for solar and wind, to being really the key to unlock faster electrification rates. So there is no one size fits all, and this is for Africa always the case, but in this case, the story is not different at all. So if you want to look at the energy mix, this is how it looks today. You have a bit of all sources, and all of them will grow through 2040. I want to spend a couple of minutes to talk about this. So here it's a continent where biomass is the mainstay of energy use. There is no other continent on the planet for which this is the case. Most of this biomass is not the biomass that we normally think of. It's not wood pellets or something very advanced. It's really very poor type of biomass. We are finding that 1.5 hours a day is spent by families to actually go out and collect this biomass. This is mostly women doing this. And on average, we are also seeing that the time spent for women to cook for the family, goes between 3 and 4 hours a day. So you put together and you have, on average, a woman in a family that is spending 5.5 hours of her time that is related to energy activities. So for cooking is very basic need. Now, if we were able to provide solutions for this, solutions for cooking, and solutions for cooking is, we find in many cases, is LPG, this would cut tremendously the time that women spend to those activities, and they could be devoted to do other things, other productive uses. So women are and need to be very key and central to everything that is related to providing access to households. They hold the key to success stories. This is very clear. Wherever there has been a success story on clean cooking, it has involved women engagement. So going forward, we see natural gas increasing, we see oil increasing, coal increasing modestly, renewables increasing tremendously. I'd like to spend 2 words on oil. If you take out of that graph the amount of use that is in South Africa and Nigeria, so 2 countries out of the entire continent, you put all the rest all together, you have still more than 650 million people that we're talking about, and they consume less than the total use of the Netherlands today. What does that mean? It means that this is a true break in moving things around. You have a key barrier in transporting things. So mobilization, transport, and energy needs are really another key factor. If you look at the power sector, this is really the area where things need to be scaled up, and we expect to be scaled up pretty quickly, a tripling over the next 25 years of installed capacity. And very clearly here you see what are the two winners. It's a combination of renewables on the one hand and of natural gas on the other. This would put Africa to be the first continent that has actually managed to do development not through a typically coal-based pattern. The US has gone through their development path using coal. UK, Germany, a lot of Europe has done that using coal. India, we will see. China has certainly done that doing coal. We have here a continent that can really have a completely different energy and development history. Is this because we think coal is bad? No, we are saying here that it makes economic sense. We are entering a period of around 5 to 10 years in which natural gas, especially thanks to LNG, will have very low prices for a significant amount of time. It opens up opportunities to have new gas-fired generations coupled with industrial uses that may really be presenting interesting development opportunities. On the other hand, we are seeing the emergence of new business models that are really opening up things that already only 2-3 years ago were not imaginable. What are those new business models? And what is happening? So there is a combination of a couple of new things. On one hand is technology cost reduction really of the energy sector. So is solar, is mini grids, batteries that are becoming cheaper. But on the other hand, is beyond the energy sector. It really has to do with digital technologies and mobile phones. So there are, globally, we find 200 million people that live above the poverty line, 200 million people that live above the poverty line but don't have access to electricity. But they do have an ability to pay. And most of those actually have a mobile phone. Most of those 200 million people have a mobile phone. There is now a niche that is opening up with what we call pay-as-you-go. Through mobile phones, actually those people are able to pay only when they consume energy and only when they can pay. So you have on one hand the cost of decentralized solution going down, an opening up of mobile phone technologies, and a third thing that is becoming, is still a bit niche, but is opening up more. We can actually measure very, very finely at the nearly minute by minute, seconds by second, to understand what a household needs. When is it using energy and for what? So digital companies are storing this information and having a pattern of exactly which kind of electricity and energy use are needed. Now, those trilogy can really open up, going forward, very quick electrification area in rural areas where normally grid extension that is planned by the governments would come much later. This combined, I go back to the cheap gas that we will be seeing for some time, is a golden opportunity. It is a golden opportunity to be used. Is the pattern to universal electricity access in those countries the same everywhere? No. So for those of you who are in this, working in this field for many years, you will know that there are always two tensions. One on people that say you have to use on-grid, forget about off-grid. And in fact, we need to understand very clearly that going forward, those two things cannot be enemies. They need to be husband and wife and hopefully get along very well together. And it may be that in certain countries like Nigeria, on-grid extension makes more sense because it's a very densely populated area, because there are available resources of gas that needs to be used and not thrown away, and it just makes sense for the geographical situation that on-grid is used. However, there will be still pockets of rural areas in Nigeria where off-grid solutions will make the most economic sense. If you travel to Ethiopia, the story is very different. It's half densely populated as Nigeria. The resource availability is completely different. There, it makes much more sense a combination where will be more towards on-grid, off-grid solution and decentralized solution, with still some grid option that will make sense. So the two really have to go hand in hand if we want to see a type of quick development going forward. Now, the other second thing that I will not show a slide about that. In these debates, there is always a big contrast, especially if you talk with people in the realm of sustainable development goals, that providing access to electricity and energy is all very good, but they don't say it very loud, but let's wait a second because we may have actually a problem with climate change. So do we really have an incentive in providing access so quickly? Well, the answer is very, very clear. The two things are not in contradictions. So our analysis, I think if there is one thing that we will be saying very clearly on the 19th of October is the following. The two things are not in contradiction. And we will go into much more detail on the 19th to explain why, but the finding is clear. Even if you, in fact, if you provide access to everyone by 2030, clean access, not clean, energy access, electricity, and cooking by 2030, the impact on greenhouse gas emissions is zero. We can elaborate further if you wish so, and I can tell you a bit more about this, but I think this is a very important finding, and there are two myths that have really to be debunked. It's not an on-grid, off-grid fight. Forget about that, they have to go hand in hand. And second, there is not climate change versus energy access fight. I'll go very quickly towards the end. The investment, and I understand we will have a bit more later on with a few other speakers. Over the past 15 years, we have seen flow of investment of around $60 billion a year flowing through Africa. A lot of those, 2/3 of those were foreign direct investments that were mostly for exports. So this is going to Africa, use resources, mostly for exports. It was not all companies, it was not all countries, but the majority of this type of investment environment that was in Africa was pretty clear. More recently, from the year 2010 onwards, there has been a large wave of Chinese investments going into the continent that have become, in energy, certainly the largest investors. The second, I'm very proud to say, being Italian, that is Italy, being the second largest investors in energy in Africa. But things have, in terms of three things they have to change. First, investment needs to be scaled up very significantly, number one. You need roughly to double what has been done for the past 15 years. So the first thing that you need to find out is how do we make sure that we double the amount of investment flowing every year. The second is that a lot of these investments have to be made for energy use that is in the continent, not elsewhere. It doesn't mean that the part for export is shrinking. It's in fact remaining very similar to what has been in the past, but the ratio of the two things have to change. It means that the investment type of opportunities has, the type of investment that you're doing has to change quite significantly. So, concluding, maybe just to put together 3-4 thoughts to leave with you and maybe to spark a bit of the debate. I really believe that we are in a pretty unique situation today. We have the convergence of a few things. On the one hand, we have signed Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, and there is a new political momentum that really can push energy access. Energy access has gone back up in the policy agenda. So a political push on one hand. On the second hand, we are seeing on the energy side, technology innovation and cost reduction that is unprecedented. So there is an opportunity out there that can be taken for opening up, especially in rural areas, that has never been there before. And the third point, we are seeing most likely ahead of us for a few years low natural gas prices. The combination of these three things is really opening up options. We shouldn't leave it aside. It's a golden opportunity. Second point, I think really the opportunity to see Africa following a completely different development path that we have been seeing for many other continents is very concrete in front of us, and it makes economic sense. The third point, a complete change in paradigm, especially for what concerns cooking, and putting women at the center of all this is crucial. This links not only into gender, but ties into growth opportunities for the continent. You would be unleashing millions of hours of work with an empowerment of a key part of the society. Fourth point that I would like you to leave this room at least looking forward on the 19th, in a couple of weeks, to the results of the report. No contradiction whatsoever between climate and energy access. And I would like to conclude here. Thank you very much to all of you.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for this very insightful presentation, but particularly thank for having celebrated the marriage of on-grid and off-grid solutions in Africa, because really the debate is poisoned sometimes. There is really somehow a very strong fight, which actually doesn't make sense. If we look at the kind of requirements of energy for the future, it's clear that there is room for accommodate both the solutions. So thank you very much for making also clarity about this very important point. Now, I would like to turn the floor to Lapo Pistelli, because as Laura mentioned, the role of private investments will be key, particularly as far as the energy that will then be consumed domestically in Sub-Saharan Africa. So, since Eni is present in Africa since basically the 1950s, I would be really interested in understanding how you see the energy challenges of Africa, of Sub-Saharan Africa, and how you see the opportunities also for European companies in the field. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Simone. I would like to thank all of you for the invitation and for being here this morning. Thank you to Laura, because my job is very easy. I do agree on 100%, word by word of what she said. We will have the time and the chance to debate again in Rome the 19th of October. I thank her because she put very clearly on the table the numbers of the equation, and that's the equation. So I would like, first of all, to recap some of the key conclusions. On the one hand, the contradiction. The contradiction means a continent which has the hugest reserves, conventional and non-conventional. To put in crude numbers, we are talking about 126 billion barrels of oil equivalent of oil and 96 of gas, and we are talking about proven reserves, not taking into consideration potential discoveries. So not regarding technological breakthrough. With this model, Africa could rely on its own resources for the next 3 centuries. On the other hand, an unsustainable mix. Because this 48% on biomasses, the 23% about relying on oil, and the less than 2% hydro and renewables is totally unsustainable. From every perspective you can adopt, is unsustainable. On the other hand, I would like to thank Bruegel for the debate, because what's happening about Africa is really a key debate, because now we are debating about energy, but I mean, it's very obvious that there's a trigger between what the EU is doing in terms of migration, giving access to energy in terms of trying to address the root causes, one of the root causes of migration, how as a continent, as Europeans, we are engaged vis-à-vis Africa. I keep repeating that if you look at the map, you will see that Africa has water south, east, west, and Europe north. So it's quite clear that we have a common destiny, the two continents have a common destiny. And this huge contradiction between being the continent of the hugest reserves, conventional and non-conventional, and having 650 million people with no access to energy. And the consumption per capita is unbelievable because it's 1/3 of a Chinese, 1/5 of a European, and 1/10 of an American, as an average. And we are talking as an average. So what about us, to put it very simple? As Simone said, Eni moved his first steps in Africa in the 50s. So looking at numbers today among the international company, among the IOCs, Eni is the most African of all IOCs in the world because in terms of production and in terms of reserve, 50% of what we are doing is done in Africa. We are the first for equity with 1 million barrel oil equivalent a day, and we have there 3 billion barrel equivalent of proven reserves. But what is more is that we are in 16 countries, we are expanding our presence, and because we are talking about investment, according to OECD, in the year 2015 and 2016, Eni was the third global largest investor in the world as a private company, but the first European, because the first company was a Chinese one, the second company was coming from United Arab Emirates, and the third one was Eni. And in the next 4 years, we are just planning $20 billion investment. So I guess that this ranking will remain even in the next 4 years. We started in the northern strip of Africa, so we're not talking about Sub-Saharan. And you can see that after 50 or 60 years of presence of Eni, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt, access to energy, I mean, is globally spread, notwithstanding with the demographic trends. But the key challenge is Sub-Saharan Africa. We are there either in the south part of the continent, Mozambique, the biggest giant discovery of gas over the last 10 years in the world. In the West Africa, Angola, Nigeria, Congo, Gabon, Ivory Coast, just to mention some countries, and in the east margin, in the east part of Africa. So what to do? Because I agree on the recipes that Laura gave. First of all, that's a political choice. You can look for resources, develop resources, and they take the resources away. Or you can leave it to the domestic market. You can sell domestically. This has been historically the political choice that Eni did since the 50s. It's clear that you are engaged in a long-term relation because, first of all, you have to develop a domestic market. You have to develop the infrastructure, the rules, the grid, whatever. But I'm, let's say, pretty proud to say that ignoring for a while the North Africa, the northern part of Africa, we are providing 60% of the energy, just to give you two numbers, of energy to Congo is 100% in Libya and Egypt, but is 60% in Congo, and 20% to countries which are really engaging, like Nigeria. And I fully agree on the mix that Laura was mentioning. So it's clear that you have to give access to energy to a remote rural area in the continent. It's not about connecting a grid. No one will invest 3,000 kilometers to connect a small village. That's about off-grid and renewables. But if you want to tackle the issue of big mega cities, Lagos, Abidjan, Abuja, it's about mixing gas to power in those countries that have plenty of power, of gas, and renewables, hybrid project. This is going to be the future. And this is going to be the excellent mix in order to give access to energy. And I would like also to emphasize that, especially in those countries, I mean, you cannot pick up and choose the energy you want, the source you want. It's about the geography of sources available. So put the case that you have not natural gas alone like you have in Mozambique. Mozambique is going to become, in the next 20, 25 years, the Qatar of East Africa. Just as we discovered 85 TCF of gas, which is huge. And we sanctioned in June a project, $6 billion, only to develop the first 5 TCF of gas. So it's clear that Mozambique will become one of the hubs, not only for East Africa, but also to export gas in this Indian subcontinent and addressing markets which are growing up fastly in terms of demography and economic growth. But if you go to Nigeria, to give an example, you have associated gas. Gas comes with oil. So you have an option. You can flare it, and if you flare it, you pollute the environment, or you can go to a gas to power and monetize it, save in terms of emission, and give access to power to the people living in megacities. So it's common sense, it's wisdom, and this is what we're doing. Just the case of Nigeria, we have one power unit, which is Okpai 1, who is giving 480 megawatt, is the first power unit to turn on in case of black shutdown, and the last one to turn off. And we are going to double it next year. So other 480 megawatt is an investment of around $700 million. And we are doing because we do believe that this is the only way to address the root causes of giving energy as a basic human right, and also to let's say, bring a brick, which is a cornerstone for stable economic growth. Because what Laura was mentioning about the blackout, yes, sometimes with a diesel generator, you can make a sort of backup. But we are talking about Africa today. But if you move to a continent where the economic growth is more stable, Pakistan instead of Bangladesh, you have sometimes blackout which are lasting 7 hours. And so that's becoming, in the last 5-6 years, a political issue about which government lose or win elections. Because you can't run any economic activity with an unpredictable blackout which can last 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours. So in Africa, we are still lagging behind. So the blackout may be shorter and is not affecting so dramatically economic activities. But if you want to boost the economy, you need to grant a stable and reliable energy access for everybody, for domestic consumption and for economic growth. So to close my perspective, I will put it very simple. You have 3 main actors. You have private sector. You have, because we are debating here in Brussels, multilateral and international institutions. You have the European Union, to put it very simple, and you have member states. And I think it's very clear today in the debate that no one of the 3 alone can address the challenge. No one alone can address the challenge. It's not about the European Commission providing a big program with no participation of the private sector. It's not about the let's say, commendable and honorable effort by single member states, and it's not about the private sector alone. So it's about combining together the effort. So what I would like to tell you and to address, let's say, symbolically to those who are representing the European institutions and the financial institutions is that, I mean, we are acting as a private sector alone. Just to give an example, when we raised the $6 billion to sanction the project to Mozambique, there was about knocking at the door, finally, of 15 different international commercial banks and 5 export credit agencies, with no single multilateral institutions backing such a project. Because everybody's talking about giving access to energy to Africa, but when you talk about country A or country B, everybody's saying, look, it's fragile, it's not reliable, how can you securitize the payment? And so you're alone to act. That's it. So if we want to be consistent with what we are saying in Europe, and the private sector that I'm, let's say, here representing, we are ready, we are on board, it's about being consistent with what we are writing in political documents. So to have the financial sector supporting those who are risking hundreds of millions of dollars investing in Africa, investing in countries where the payment system is fragile, where only in East Africa the phone monetics is well developed, not in West Africa. In some of the debate in West Africa, energy in the domestic debate is considered for free. I just connect to what I'm finding, and that's for free. And if you want to let the people pay for the energy, you're going to risk your post, your job in Parliament. So, I mean, it's a huge debate, but I think we are ready, and we would like to have member states and financial institutions supporting all of us. Because I think that, as I said before, it's a destiny. It's a common fate. Let me end the conversation with a number. I started with geography, and I will end up with demography. In 1950, Europe had a population which was 2 times the African population. We were the double. And these are numbers, these are facts, figures. In 2002, the population of Africa and the population of EU was the same exactly. In 2050, according to the average scenario of UN demographics, Africa will be 3 times the population of Europe. Or we take seriously that we have a common faith together, and it's not about stopping the wind with our hands, or we are going to lose the challenge. So I think that we are on board. We are ready to carry on our responsibility as we did in the last 50 years, but we need that member states, European institutions, private companies, those who are strong enough to carry on responsibility, and the financial sector need to act together. That's it. Thank you.
Well, I would say message received. Thank you very much for such a strong push, which I think is exactly what one should expect from debates as this one in Brussels, where sometimes you really need to provide a little bit of more energy into what policymakers are really elaborating, reflecting on, but then actually doing, right? So there is often a gap. So it's very good to have this kind of stimulus. Lex, let me then turn to you, since now we discussed widely the outlook for energy assets. We understand that a receipt seems to be the tandem of renewables on the one hand and gas on the other, but what can you, as a World Bank group, do to support investors like Lapo and many others acting in Africa? What can you do?
Me personally, I have a big wallet.
What can you do to help the companies there to do what they have to do to foster energy assets? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Simone, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me thank you all for inviting me to this prestigious institution. I've been asked to reflect on the barriers to the development of energy investments in Sub-Saharan Africa and where international financial institutions can provide a sensible contribution. And it's just a little piece of the puzzle of this debate this morning, but I hope it helps to discuss things further. Is it this way? Yeah. Excellent. So let's start with the question: why is the power supply in Africa such a persistent question? And we think that there are two root causes. One is the cause that Laura already mentioned, that electricity provision is a key condition for economic growth anywhere, also in Africa. And secondly, that governments have historically financed the sector in the region, and more private sector investment is required to meet the needs. And sub-Saharan African countries lag behind in various ways. Although the access to electricity has increased significantly over the last 15 years, overall access rates remain much lower than in the rest of the world. Reliability remains inadequate, which the huge cost required to invest in backup generation. And because of all that, most electricity tariffs remain high compared to other continents, while the remaining well, they remain below the cost of generation in many cases, and hence significant subsidies are required in many countries, which have a crippling effect. So our clients in Sub-Saharan Africa, they face a number of structural factors that prevent the optimal development of the markets. And if we take Ghana as an example and compare that with the state of Texas in the United States, Ghana is one of the most developed countries with regard to electricity in West Africa, with a 75% access rate, which is more than Nigeria. It has abundant hydropower resources as well as natural gas and oil. Population is similar to that of Texas, and yet the power system is 34 times smaller than that of Texas. Other sub-Saharan African countries have even smaller systems. Now, you're probably all aware that economies of scale are very significant in electricity supply. On the generation side, for the same generating technology, capex and opex per unit decrease significantly with the size, but there's also the fact that certain generation technologies can only be deployed at a larger scale. On the transmission and distribution side, the cost per unit decreases with the density of consumption, and in this respect, Sub-Saharan Africa is impacted by the low income per capita, the large rural population, and also with cities that are spread out. And then there are certain fuels that require a dedicated infrastructure, such as natural gas, that can only be economic past a certain threshold. In addition, in about every single sub-Saharan African country, we can observe to a more or less a degree poor investment planning, inadequate maintenance, inefficiencies in operations, poor commercial performance by utilities with tariffs below cost recovery, making the utilities insolvent, and corruption, which contributes to any of these factors above. So where does the World Bank try to make a contribution in the energy sector in Africa? We work along the whole value chain. We provide knowledge, we convene partnerships, and we leverage our own limited resources and financial instruments to crowd in commercial and private financing. And we expand South-South cooperation along the value chain. So as an example, in fiscal year 14, we spent about 8.5 billion along the energy value chain. Now, is that enough to meet sustainable development goals? Not by far. And that's why we have a strategy to leverage even more commercial and private financing on top of what we can invest and provide as lending ourselves. So some of the instruments that we use doing that include sector reforms to improve the investment climate. We try to enhance institutional capacity to govern the sector. We help to structure bankable projects. We provide risk guarantees, both political risk guarantees and commercial risk guarantees, to take away some of the risks around payment, for example. We lend to both public and the private sector. And we take equity participations on a project level, but also directly in private sector. So let's not forget about the off-grid solutions. Over the past few years, there's been a lot of improvement in the quality of solutions that are provided and in lowering the cost of making those solutions available. And this is starting to make a large impact in rural areas. And yet the access to finance, and in this case it's mostly microfinance, remains the biggest barrier to growth. So let me stop my intervention here, and happy to address other questions in the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lex. And I think it's now the turn of San to share with us some of the preliminary results of a study that is being carried out, and I think it will be presented tomorrow as a draft, right? On what the European institutions are doing to support energy development in Africa. So since we, particularly in Brussels, heard a lot about the external investment plan and many other initiatives ongoing, I'm very curious to learn from you, how do you see these initiatives going? Thank you very much to be here with us.
Well, thank you very much. Also, I have a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if it would come up. But it is, thank you very much for the opportunity of sharing some of our insights. It was indeed the intention to try to provide an overview of what the EU is doing. Turns out to be rather impossible because there are so many different instruments and so many different initiatives that it is quite difficult. So we had to try to pick up some of the issues and try to identify what is the EU doing and whether it is effective or not, or at least try to adjust some of its approaches in order to increase its efficiency. I think the first point to keep in mind is that the EU and its member states is the largest donor in general, and also the largest donor in terms of energy support. So it has in itself, then the role that it's going to play is really important. And out of this support that is provided to energy, a third is dedicated to Africa, and about a bit more than a sixth is going to Sub-Saharan Africa. So while Africa is an important challenge, it is not the main focus of Europe. And in fact, out of the 10 largest ODA recipients of EU aid, there's only 8 of them have an electrification rate of higher than 90%. And if I had the presentation, I could show, but it doesn't matter. But if we look at in Africa also about the rate of electrification and the level of ODA that is provided, we see that in fact more ODA per capita is going to countries that tend to have a higher rate of electrification than a lower rate one. This is not to blame, in fact, because we can, of course, imagine that countries that require a lot of power generation and so on, very costly investments, you will have more ODA that is going to these elements. But if the purpose is to try to foster access to electricity, in particular to address the issue that has been mentioned before about providing access to electricity to the population, the large population in Africa that does not have access, then when perhaps not putting all the resources or sufficiently emphasis where we should put it. Having said that, I would like to keep in mind that there are basically two not necessarily incompatible but slightly different objectives when you want to focus access to energy. One is for trying to stimulate economic growth and to provide economic transformation and increase the productivity. If there is no access to electricity, we talked about blackouts and not sufficient access to electricity for companies that are trying to do productive activities. That is in itself a huge impediment. And I think that's the elements that has the strongest potential to stimulate development in the long run, to have a productive process. However, the other dimension of the access to energy is to improve the livelihood, and that has been mentioned is probably more off-grid type of access and help enhance the livelihood of the people, which has an important dimension of human rights and quality of life, which has also, as was mentioned, by Laura, the capacity to perhaps also liberate times from domestic activities for more productive activities. That's why I was saying the two dimensions are not opposed to one another. Nonetheless, they do provide perhaps the objectives is slightly different, and also the tools that we're having. This was the map that was showing the rate of electricity. So what is the EU doing in terms of financing for energy? It's using mainly two types of instruments. One is the more traditional grants, the other one is the blending. And the focus of our work has been more on the blending and trying to see how the EU grants can leverage loans and private finance. But it is important to remember that this is only one of the instruments that exist. And there are a number of financial instruments that have been developed at the EU level. The African Investment Facility, Electrify, and you have now the new setup with the external investment plan, with the European Fund for Sustainable Development, that is providing huge opportunities in the future for financing sustainable energy, with the creation of a specific investment window that will be dedicated to that objective for both the neighborhood and the Africa policy. But the EIB, the EBRD, the European DFIs are also very active, all very active in the role in supporting financing energy. Then there are other initiatives that lead to promoting technical assistance, try to enhance the quality of the project, so a bit along the lines also of, in fact, mimicking to some extent what the World Bank and IFC are also trying to do with the financing instrument on the one hand, and providing technical assistance in terms of enhancing the quality of the projects that are available. RICIP is a good example for that, or the technical assistance facility for sustainable energy for all is another example of such support, but also going beyond the specific support to provide better quality projects, but also to try to improve the regulatory environment and the support. And that leads to the third dimension, is that you cannot have sustainable investment in energy if the investment environment is not a conducive one. And if the regulation of electricity market, and if the basic regulation that is required for a market to exist is not in place. So there's a need to have a combined approach and to go beyond the simple project-based approach that is there. What do we see is perhaps some generic observations that we had when we look at what the EU is doing, is that it has very ambitious energy-related objectives and has a lot of financial instruments that are in place. So in that sense, it is, taking, it is realizing the stake of the challenge ahead and also the opportunities that exist. But beyond the specific project results, there is in fact very little information of what is really the impact and what are the results of all these different activities. So there is, I think, a need for the EU and the Commission in particular to better consolidate some of the the results and the achievements of the various instruments, to be able to show what they are doing and what is the impact of what they're doing. And the second elements that we see in discussing also with these with the managers of the various financing instruments is that the problem is not the number of projects. The problem is sometimes the quality of the projects and the financial means that exist to finance these good projects. So that seems to suggest that, in fact, if there is more technical assistance that is provided, if more financing is made available, then much more projects could also be financed. So it is doing well, but it could be even much more. The second point is that the blending activities and looking at these blending financing instruments is by no means a silver bullet. There are some projects that are not bankable projects, either because they are poor quality projects or because they have a low impact on poverty, or simply because the market is not sufficiently developed. And so, in fact, for blending, you still need to have a viable return on your investment. And if that's not the case, then you need to have to rely on grants and pure subsidies. So to try to sometimes, the feeling we had is that trying to ask, sometimes we ask too much from the blending and imagining that blending grant and leveraging private sector finance will be able to address all the problems in the energy, and that's not possible. Which leads, in fact, to the approach that I was mentioning before on the type of instruments that exist, is that the external investment plan is trying to bring some coherence and a coherent approach to what the Commission has been doing in the past, with this focus on EFSD and the financing instruments to finance energy. The second pillar, which is more about technical assistance, both for project preparation and for policy reforms, and this third pillar that is about the regulatory environment. And so in its conception, in fact, the EIP is not especially new. Probably the key new element is the risk guarantee dimensions that is contained under the FSD, and that could be very important to finance sustainable energy in more risky environments, like in Sub-Saharan Africa. But the second main innovation is trying to coordinate these three pillars with these three approaches, instruments that the EU has indeed at its disposal. And the EIP is probably not only one step, since there will be activities also beyond the EIP. There are activities, as I mentioned, also some of the DFIs will participate, but DFIs and multilateral investors are going to have other initiatives. So there's also a point of trying to think beyond what the EIP is doing with the other actors, and also what the EU is doing in terms of grant support, including budget support and grant project support that does keep its relevance. Let me conclude by identifying some of the challenges and opportunities that exist. I think there's a question at the technical level I just mentioned of whether blending is really fit for purpose. It is, but it is fit for some purpose, not for all the purposes. And perhaps the question of, in particular, reaching out the poorest part of the population in the very remote rural areas, where bankability is sometimes questionable, trying to reach that and have that as an objective for some of the blending facilities that might not be a very good issues. The second one is the question of reporting and criteria that are used by these financing instruments and facilities that are put in place. And there's there's a range of criteria, so it seems to be multi-purpose, and again, there's a question of can we, with one stone, kill so many birds? But there's also the question of whether the pressure that is put to show results, especially in the short term, and to disburse the finance that is put in place, is that we're not creaming simply the best potential project and not investing enough on the more difficult type of innovation. So we know that we need to have a longer term perspective. At the political level, I think there's a need to take into consideration the local context that are there. So there's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. There's a need to take into account also the interest of stakeholders, vested interests. Some will be in favor of access to energy, but you also have monopolistic situations. You have those that will be affected by changes to access to energy, and these also have to be explicitly taken into account. So the issue is not purely a question of finding the right technical solutions, but it's also to try to better understand some of the local dynamics that exist. And the opportunities are, of course, that Africa is really taking the lead into addressing its own access to energy. So it is also important that the instruments that are put in place, including at the European level, harness very well what is done by the private sector, and so respond to the needs of the private sector, respond to what or can also be coherent with the multilateral initiatives that are taking that are taking place, but primarily that they respond to the local dynamics and that they rather try to enhance the instruments at the African level, rather than trying to substitute to what would happen. So the external investment plan is a good step in that direction, and there are many other initiatives, but I think some of these dynamics have to be clearly taken into account if we want to be more effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, San, and sorry for the interruption at the beginning. I think that my colleagues wanted to give us a flavor of how a blackout should look like, probably, but sorry for that. I would now like to open the floor for questions and answers from our panelists, but first of all, I would like to seize the opportunity of being the moderator to ask to our panelists the first question. That really builds on what San just illustrated and really focuses on the European potential contribution to fostering energy access in Africa, because since we are in Brussels, I think it's very important to come up with some clear messages to the European policymakers. If we look at Africa, we cannot avoid to adopt a global perspective. There are other players in the world that are interested in following what happens in Africa. Of course, we know that China has a very coherent strategy in the continent. We know that the United States, during the Obama administration, created this initiative, Power Africa, to put the house in order and coordinate all the actions on Africa of the various federal agencies plus the US private sector. In Europe, we have this newly established EU External Investment Plan, but we have also the European Development Fund, the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, the Africa Investment Facility, the Electrification Financing Initiative, the Global Energy Efficiency and Renewable Fund, the EU Africa Trust Investment Fund, the Investment Facility. These are just initiatives carried out by the European Commission. So, is it time for Europe to put the house in order, to streamline our action towards Africa in order to also have a bigger leverage in the field? Lapo, Laura, Alex.
I think, just a quick reaction, I think that the Juncker plan is a first step in this direction. I mean, I understand it's a way also to repackage some funds and to maybe end up a time of fragmentation that you mentioned before. It's clear that after a lot of announcement and big debate about that, we are now looking at the details of the rules, and we need to go into the details about the rules. Personally, if I have a message to send to the EU decision makers, is about what I said and what Laura said about the new energy mix in Africa. Because it seems to me, frankly speaking and humbly speaking, that in the conventional conversation, there's a sort of overlapping in the debate, but maybe sometimes even in the rules, that allow people to think that the future and the sustainable energy means only renewable energy. While we are talking about a mix where renewable and gas go hand in hand. And if I look at the projects that are bankable and financeable by the European Bank of Investment and the World Bank, both of them are taking into consideration gas project as renewable project at the same level. The European Investment Bank has only a sort of technical criterion, which is about the level of emissions. It's a 550 grams for CO2 for kilowatt hour. So if you are below the threshold, it's safe. If you are above the threshold, it's off. But it's not an ideological debate. So I think that if you want to improve the level of investment and the number of companies who could be on board, even in this Juncker plan, providing big projects, it's clear that the gas to power are substantially big projects, Ongrid and big projects. You have to allow them to be in. And it seems to me now that the debate started in the good way, but in a number of public meetings that we had with EU decision makers, there was still a doubt about that. So I would like that the EU would fit with the kind of conversation that the World Bank, to give an example, and the European Investment Bank has. If those three instruments are in the same at the same level with the same rules, that would ease very much the commitment and the work for the private sector.
Thank you very much. Laura, would you like to add something on this, or?
Very, very quickly, that I think that sometimes we tend to think that when everything is very coherent and well organized and not fragmented, things can go better, but it's simply because we are able to grasp them better. I think that the push, in an ideological push to have everything organized under one umbrella, that would go at the cost of speed and agility of disbursing money and doing action on the ground, would be a very counterproductive way of moving. So certainly a certain degree of organization is good and having an umbrella, but if this goes at the cost of imposing a hierarchy, imposing and slowing down action on the ground, then we need to think carefully. The second point, I think even the impression that today, overwhelmingly, the debate is still very focused on electricity access, regardless of how this electricity is produced, but we talk mostly about electricity. We very rarely hear talking about cooking. We very rarely hear talking about productive uses. We very rarely hear talking about transport fuels. I think it's time to enlarge the conversation and broaden it from electricity to energy. Too often, we use electricity and energy interchangeably. They are not necessarily the same thing. Especially if you talk about development, we are looking something broader than just electricity.
Lex, wanted to...
Yeah, just a small remark, perhaps less focusing on your question about EU coherent approach, because I would agree with Laura that whereas it makes sense to have a coherent approach, it shouldn't go at the cost of the speed of actually doing something. But I'd like to make a remark on something that Lapo said about the energy mix. I think in an unconstrained world where you have sufficient financing to address each and every topic, you indeed need to be very aware of that shift in energy mix. I think where we are as a World Bank, we realize that what we have available as potential financing means, although sizable, it's still very limited compared to the overall needs. So we have to make choices. We have to see where can we have the most impact. And in doing so, we are driven, of course, by the overall objectives of the bank of reducing poverty, and energy access plays a big role there. But there's also a strong focus in the bank on greening our investments where we can. Of course, that shouldn't go at the cost of the development of our clients, of the economies of our clients. So we will support them along a range of different aspects of the energy mix. But it does mean that, for example, if you look along the value chain, where we see that on the upstream side, particularly in oil and gas, it's much easier to raise private financing than in the midstream or certain downstream areas. And it's felt that we can make a stronger contribution there. Having said that, we still do make investments, lending equity in the upstream as well, where that is required and where that's justified. But choices need to be made, and we need to look at where are the strengths not only of ourselves but also of others to fit together in that overall picture.
Thank you. Sam, would you like?
Yes. Well, I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all, and I think diversity and sometimes even competition is good. And as we were trying to say, there are diversity of of markets, a diversity of needs and context. So in that sense, to have different instruments is per se not a negative thing. I think the problem that some of the actors have, and in particular, I think from the EU perspective, in terms of strategy and in terms of reaching out to the private sector, is are there really such big differences in the different instruments? And I think, I mean, I avoided in my own presentation to go through this all listening. Simona, you did it probably rightly so. But indeed, there's this question, do we all understand exactly what are all these different instruments about? And I think there's an element of repetition. So there might be, from a strategic perspective, streamlining. The second one, and that's also a positive point of the external investment plan, is the idea of having a one-stop shop for private sectors and those that are trying to look at, well, we want to get finance, and perhaps beyond the external investment plan is more than simply financing through the FSD, but if I understand correctly what the Commission wants to do is also to have with this one-stop shop to be able to do this mapping of all the different instruments and to be able then to direct the different projects or investors required to the right institution. Now, that might lead to indeed some bureaucracy, but at the moment, for the private sector, it's sometimes very difficult to know at which door they should knock because there are so many institutions and they don't necessarily know what's the background of each of them.
That was exactly the point. Laura, you wanted to say something?
Very quickly on the point raised by the World Bank on prioritization, I completely agree that there has to be prioritization made. The resources are always scarce, etc. However, having said that, I think that globally we need to raise, especially the cooking part, at a much higher level. And when you're talking about overall investment needs, the cooking needs to provide clean cooking to all would be a tenth of what you're talking about electricity. So it's not about the amount of money. It's about having a political understanding that this is a critical issue and that can be solved. And in fact, it could be solved much more easily than the electricity one, but it just doesn't get the attention. If you look at the numbers globally, there are today 2.5 billion people that use a primitive way of cooking. If you look at the number today, if you look at the same number 15 years ago, it has not changed at all.
Yeah, thanks. And this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning about this indoor air pollution problem, which is really important in Africa. So the human dimension of the issue is extremely big. I will now open the floor. We still have time for a couple of questions. So please just raise your hands. I saw a question there, so please.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations for the high quality of the presentations and of the debate. I have a comment and three questions, if I may. The comment is first about the cost of energy, as we heard. Too often, I think, we focus on the generation cost, and we are talking about access to energy. So we should better talk about the cost of the full value chain of the energy. It means production, transmission, distribution, and then access equipment and whatever is necessary to get the services supplied to the end users. Now, three questions. The first one is, I am very pleased to hear the mix of renewables and gas. That means no ideological debate about zero carbon whatsoever. By the way, I would even add nuclear to that mix. What I am a bit surprised, I must confess, is to have hardly heard about hydropower. Thinking of Inga, 40 gigawatts. Thinking of the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Thinking of a number of big and mainly also very small projects, little turbines here and there, 300 megawatts or even 10 megawatts. Which really, as you may have heard about a project like in Virunga Park, is also a new way of going for development. Having the local population take ownership of the energy sources and then getting slowly developed. So that is my first question, hydropower. Where is hydropower in your mix? Second question is education and training. I have hardly heard about the need for education and training. especially training, or also basic education, of course, whenever we go for technical assistance in emerging countries. We have heard many times, and I am very happy, the word long-term. Long-term is all about local training. And I wish we could have, even in the Commission, I myself, I used to work in the Commission many years ago, a kind of mandatory place in the contract for training whenever money is put in technical assistance. And the third, I was pleased to hear by San Bilan in particular about the lack of impact evaluation. And my question is maybe a bit academic. I myself, I am now with the Belgian Academy of Sciences. Are there instruments for impact evaluation of international collaboration, especially in the energy domain in Africa? I have heard of Polymi, for example. Milano has a team working on that. By the way, Milano has the UNESCO chair. That is an idea maybe for the World Bank also. UNESCO is paying a number of chairs worldwide, focusing on improving technical assistance, not only from the engineering point of view, but also from the impact evaluation point of view. And I wish maybe European Commission, of course, but also other institutions, and maybe also private sector, could think of funding chairs in European and, of course, African universities to support improvement of what we have said.
Thank you.
Okay, that's
Thank
all.
you very much. Thank you very much. I would then probably turn to Laura first, and then Lapo, hydro, training issues. Maybe we can start with
very, very quickly. I'll take the hydro one when I show the slide on the power generation mix of the future. Two elements. First, we see hydro in Africa as having been one of the key success stories in providing electricity access over the past, and we see this remaining in the future. Having said this, there is a big however. The large hydro programs require very good regional cooperation. Yeah. In some instances, this is going in the right direction. It's not always the case, so it adds a layer of complication. I personally think that the Grand Renaissance this year, the moment the first electrons flow, it has to be hugely celebrated, really hugely celebrated, and recognized as a huge, huge, huge success. So I really completely agree, but it goes together with a big cultural shift of regional, of breaking even more barriers than what we're talking about now. I would just stop here.
Yeah, I have two comments, really interesting questions. The first one is about assistance and local impact. Just as a number, we as ENI, I can tell you only about us, it's clear. We have as an average in Africa 80% of our employees which are local. But in some and I think this has been also a sort of, let's say, not secret, but key factor of our success. Many times I've been asked about how can you run power plants, gas in Libya. 100% of our employees are Libyans. So the NOC is run by Libyans. They are working in their company. And so this gives you an explanation on why they are defending the plants, they are working, they have local community projects which are run by the company, and so on and so forth. And in terms of high skill education, one of the big ideas since the time of the founder of Enrico Mattei was to recruit and train in Italy the most promising young people that were selected in the countries. Just a couple of weeks ago, I, let's say, celebrated the graduation ceremony in Milano, the Master Medea, where we had the 80 graduates this year. 50 of them are coming outside Italy, from Asia, from Africa, from 15 different countries. It's a way to invest on the human capital, and it's really amazing. About hydropower, I agree on what Laura said. So I want to make a comment, let's say, as an informed person. It's not about being any or whatever. It's about GERD. It's interesting. But I would like to emphasize this issue here in Brussels, because one of the key points, I would say, of the values pillar of the European Union has been moving conflict resources in shared resources, coal and iron, since the 50s. So this is the secret to try to communicate to the regional context in Africa. The Nile is something on which Egyptians, since the time of Nasser, could wage a war to everybody. Nile is a myth in the identity of Egyptian people. And if you have to manage not the first, but the third or the fourth big dam about the Blue Nile, if I'm not wrong, it's a 6 gigawatt project, 15,000 employees, workers, in the construction of a dam, but you have a crucial issue, which is the payback period, because the quickest pace you fill the basin, the most impacting is the consequence on the environment and on the river. So the Ethiopian government, to give just this piece of information, is paying upfront the whole investment with taxes. So if you move the window of payback to 15 years or 20 years because you need 15 years to fill the basin, you have a kind of financial curve. If you want to do it in 5 years, you stop the water, you fill the basin, but then you are destroying Egyptian agriculture. So this is the kind of political enigma or conundrum that you have to debate at the regional level. And you need a lot of cooperation, and I think that Europeans could provide some historical expertise about that.
Thank you. Lex?
Yeah, very quickly. Thank you, Simone. I fully support your observation about the need for education and training. And in fact, one of the challenges that I mentioned earlier in my intervention is around the lack of capacity to properly govern the sector in many countries. So as World Bank, we spent an enormous amount of effort on capacity building projects. We see ourselves not just as a bank with financing instruments, but also as a knowledge bank. So a lot of effort goes into that. Also, your point on impact evaluation is very astute. Sometimes very difficult to do so, I agree, and perhaps we don't see it as often as it should. Still, a lot of very interesting work is going on in my organization, and if you visit our website, there's loads of information on that topic that you can pick up.
Simon?
Yeah, just in 2 words. Just perhaps to stress the importance indeed of the regional dimension, in particular in Africa, where indeed the management of water resources is often done at the regional level, and many of the regional organizations also have energy power pool, and there will be no long-term solution to energy in Africa if we ignore the regional dimension. So that's what I was mentioning also, of the need to build on the own African initiatives also includes in fact, the regional initiatives that are taken. So not to say they don't have their own problems, but I think it's to try to make them more effective and supports their endeavors that is really key to achieve the energy.
Thank you very much. I would ask just if there is another, but really one more question, very quick. Matteo?
Thank you, Simone. Mr. Pestelli suggested that there are 3 players, like private investors, then the European Union and member states. Like, do anybody in the panel see a model or a platform that can be used to get those 3 players together? And Simone, you mentioned the EU Electrify Africa hotspots in your paper. Is there anything to add on that?
Well, I don't know if you also want to.
I declare.
I think it is really clear that more coordination is needed, and let's really hope that the Commission will use this EU External Investment Fund to really create this one-stop shop, which is really crucial for the investors to understand which kind of public support they can get. Because as it is today, the situation, to me, it looks very fragmented. It is very difficult to understand where to go to ask support. So having already a platform that can be even created within the EU External Investment Plan that can provide this information and a little bit redirect the request to the different existing facilities, that will be already something really valuable. So let's hope and let's bring forward this message of coordination to the Commission. Please, but then we have to close. Yes.
One word is that the external investment plan in its third pillar foresees this political dialogue and these possible platforms to have the various stakeholders at the country level.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you and to our speakers particularly for having come. And